to the ASEAN Peoples Speak. I am Regine Jessica Abuel, your host for this podcast. For today's episode, we will be covering a new and interesting topic with the help of Professor Vitit Muntarbhorn. It's about the internet, cyberspace, and its relation to human rights. Exciting, isn't it? Before we start with our podcast, let me introduce to you our guest for today. And let me start off by saying that this person, or Professor Vitit Muntarbhorn, is an international human rights expert, a Professor Emeritus at the Law Faculty, Chulalongkorn University in Thailand. He has helped the United Nations in various positions. Currently, he is the UN Special Rapporteur on Cambodia, and he has also held various positions like a UN independent expert and a member of the UN Commissions of Inquiry on Human Rights. Professor Vitit has extensive experience in research, policy development, and advocacy in the field of human rights, and is also an author of many publications on human rights issues, including his latest book, which was just published this year, entitled Challenges of International Law in the Asian Region. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let us welcome in today's podcast, Professor Vitit Muntarbhorn. Yay! Hello, sir.
Hello.
Good evening.
How are you?
How are you? How is Thailand?
Thailand is fine. It's relatively sunny at the moment. We have just opened up a little bit, but COVID is still around the corner, unfortunately.
Yes, I know the challenges that we are facing, but it's also good though that we're able to at least still connect with each other with the use of technology and cyberspace and, video conferences like these. Anyway, Professor Vitit, can you walk us through your journey as a human rights advocate? You tell us how it all started?
Oh, it's very simple, really. I'm a volunteer. And ever since my youth, I have been a volunteer. And that's how I started human rights work. I was cleaning windows and pruning trees for senior citizens when I was in my teens. And then when I started as a teacher, I was doing development work in poor areas of Thailand. So I learned about development from there. And then I progressed to various issues on human rights, such as children's issues, women's issues, refugees by the Thai border, etc., until I started to write more, teach more, know more, help more. And, the UN started to ask me to help. That's how I started, just as a volunteer, not really planning to be a human rights advocate, actually.
Advocate.
Didn't plan, all coincidental. Just a bit of goodwill helps.
Oh, I see. But what were your fondest memories then when you were a volunteer or in your first few years in this advocacy or in your work?
Appreciating people's kindness and not being presumptuous about oneself. In other words, if you go out to help develop people, in fact, they help to develop you or me simultaneously because you reciprocate in terms of kindness, they reciprocate in terms of kindness, and it's a mutual development. That's what I learned, particularly from the field, to be very humble about it.
But have after working with different or various groups though, were there any challenges that you remember that you had to face, or things that probably struck you the most, especially when it comes to doing your work for vulnerable sectors in society?
Well, I team up with a lot of NGOs, as well as some government people, as well as some UN people and agencies. I often find people very frustrated about human rights situations. In my training with particularly NGOs, the first session is usually about stress management, actually. So I think it's very important to relay the message that when you do human rights, you yourself or we have to also look after our well-being so as to be able to sustain our work. Otherwise, we're going to be very frustrated. In fact, I do believe that as a human rights advocate, so to speak, coincidentally, I'm here to give hope. I'm not here to frustrate or feel frustrated or convey the message that I'm frustrated at all.
That's very nice of you, then, Professor. So, what are the things that you have that have you? What are the things that you do then to help yourself also? I mean, I understand that sometimes you are there to give hope, but then you also have to nourish yourself as well, other than um, trying to empathize also with other people or the people that you're helping with. Are there other things also that you do personally?
Of course, absolutely. I think it's very good to keep fit physically and mentally.
Mm-hmm.
So I advise my friends to keep fit and look after ourselves as well as, of course, everybody else. I play sports, I run, I swim, I yoga, I pray, particularly for other people. I pray for the groups that I'm working for, and I try to forgive. So, in fact, if I get lambasted, which I do, or attacked, I tend to pray for those who attack me. And I don't respond very much. In fact, I take a lot of the brunt, so to speak. But of course, if it's defamation, I would have to respond. But usually there's a very measured response from me in terms of how I choose to respond. And then I just transcend it ultimately and move on, actually.
Mm. So, being a human rights advocate also somehow asks you to be a whole or a well-rounded person, and more or less it doesn't just stop with the work. You also really have to take care of yourself as well. With what you said, you've probably also just not nourishing yourself physically but also emotionally and psychologically. You've mentioned a while ago, Professor Vitit, that you have been lambasted or you have encountered some other people that are not too positive, or they actually do not reciprocate well with the work that you do. Comparing that, has this happened to you just recently, or is it has happened to you in the past? I'd like to
It's
ask because
yeah.
I want to ask, how would you be able to compare the your human rights work then and now, and what do you think is the biggest difference?
Well, I think it's a very graduated response that we should
Mm-hmm.
bear in mind. I've already said that I can take a lot of critique and criticisms, and I tend not to respond, but to pray for people's kindness, actually, to me and to
Mm-hmm.
others. So that's how I initially respond. But sometimes, there are systemic issues at stake. If I'm dealing with a certain country on behalf of the UN, there is the opportunity and also the necessity to respond publicly in terms of helping the UN respond. So that's a systemic response in which I'm also involved. And I'm doing that continually. I've been doing this continually for 30 years on and off in terms of helping the UN and then responding to some critiques from various countries, etc. But I try and do this in a constructive and rational way. And I don't like a personalized approach. This is a systemic response from the UN, and I trigger it, of course, but it shouldn't be too personal, so to speak. And I don't particularly like to attack people by name. I very rarely write names in my articles and even UN reports.
I see. Well, in your 30 years as an advocate, you've mentioned a while ago, what do you think is the biggest difference now when it comes to advocating for human rights? Aside from the differences in how people would view it, or especially every time you would have to issue a report or submit something to the United Nations.
Well, I
Was
think
there ever any difference from before?
of course, it's ever changing. I mean, that's the whole
Mm-hmm.
point of human rights implementation. We tend to look at the whole broad spectrum of civil, political, economic, social, cultural rights. And in the ASEAN region, you have ups and downs. At a certain point in time, several countries of ASEAN were quite democratic. now they're less democratic, or even when they have the facade of democracy, they might be impinging upon a whole range of human rights, particularly political rights. So it's up and down on many fronts, actually, in terms of the evolution of human rights in this region and beyond. And there are other issues that have crept on humanity as a whole. 30 years ago, technology was less innovative than now, so to speak, and less expedited. 30 years ago, it was only the beginnings of the just very small inkling of cyberspace. But today's topic, so to speak, we're dealing with very rapid expansion and mutation of cyberspace. Everybody knows the latest word, which is metaverse. Your avatars. Now we're talking about avatars, which we weren't talking about 30 years ago. So technological response, innovation, both opportunities and threats at the same time, as well as, of course, how humanity has sadly degraded the environment, and the environment is now impinging on us in terms of climate change. And all these things are manifested very much through COVID-19 itself, which came through a certain negative environment in terms of the spread of pandemics caused by, in part, linkage with the abnormalities arising from certain strands of nature, which ultimately affect humanity as well. So these are mutations, so to speak, in terms of how we have been developing. But some issues are old issues, but seen in a new light, particularly lack of democracy in this region.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned a while ago, Professor Vitit, about technology and cyberspace and artificial intelligence, how it has changed at least the demographics also, and how it could impact human rights. How do you think did these things, especially now that we're in the modern world or in the digitalized world, how do you think this impacts now to human rights?
Well, traditionally we look at human rights in terms of advocacy to the state, in terms of the state being a duty bearer, so to speak. And yet today, I think what's very important is the linkage between the state as a duty bearer, but others who also have to bear a certain responsibility and accountability, particularly the private sector. And now, of course, the digital sector, which has been growing exponentially in terms of platforms and gigabytes and gigs and software, hardware, etc. So this is the new phenomenon that's crept on us, particularly during the past 10 years. And I think from my perspective, while we are preparing and responding in a rational manner on some fronts, we are not doing enough on other fronts. And that's really the topic of the conversation today.
Well, I came across your opinion, Professor Vitit, in the Bangkok Post, wherein you mentioned certain things about the whole topic. Could you walk us through a little bit of how the law then should address these emerging issues or topics when it comes to cyberspace, artificial intelligence, or the 3 A's that you talked about, or you're advocating for?
The perspective of cyberspace has crept up on us, willingly, unwillingly, particularly during the past 15 years. And countries are responding constructively on some fronts, but are not responding constructively on other fronts, particularly in regard to human rights. What do I mean? Well, the classic case is COVID-19, which has been wreaking havoc for the past 2 years. Countries have all opted for more online teaching, which is part of cyberspace in terms of automation and digitalization. And they all realize that they have to shift to some cyber-related machinery, so to speak, in terms of online. But the consequences of online have not been dealt with adequately on some fronts. For example, number one, the online gap. Some people have and some people don't have online, sadly. So that's increasing the technological poverty that has crept up on us, particularly with COVID. Number two, their responses in terms of automation have also not responded well enough to how we are going to enable humans to diversify when the place at work of humans is being taken over by automation, maybe machinery generally, or computers, or ultimately AI, which we'll talk about in a moment. So what is the world of work in the next phase when we really need to diversify and reskill? And the right to work, so to speak, has to have a new meaning in terms of dealing with displacements caused by digitalization. And in regard to automation as a whole, also, the accountability factor is a very important one in terms of the usage of automation, whether it be computers or whatever. And here, the response of many countries is to look at the issue of crimes or cyber crimes very much from a national security angle. And many countries in the ASEAN region have been adopting very broad laws, particularly on internet gateway or internet control or cybersecurity laws, which are very broad, justified according to those countries by national security reasons. But in fact, if you look hard and fast at all these developments in terms of legislative responses, in terms of cyber crimes as linked with automation, they impede, they impinge a lot on human rights. And I would say unjustly on many fronts. Why? Because freedom of expression, freedom of association and assembly are often constrained by these cyber laws that are now being passed in this region, as well as internet gateway laws. The international position is that when you have a cyber law to deal with cyberspace, electricity.
No problem. No problem.
When you deal with cyberspace issues, you should be very specific rather than have a general law that puts a lot of discretion in the hands of the authorities under the rubric of national security. So I think the ASEAN countries should really adopt a wiser approach of looking at specificity in terms of the typology of cybercrimes laws or internet-related laws that they are adopting, rather than just very generalized laws which put too much power in the hands of the authorities. And of course, you're dealing with a region that's more than half non-democratic. So of course, this power structure is going to lead to potentially or actually real abuses in terms of also constraints on democracy and a whole range of human rights. So the message is, if you are to have laws on internet or on cyber crimes, etc., you should be very specific. How? Well, for example, you should have a law against child pornography, or maybe against fraud, or the traditional sort of phishing, in terms of hacking of machinery. But you shouldn't just have a law which says, we must protect the national security or the cyber security of the state against certain types of media which use cyber-related machinery and data. And the model, I think, that we look to is this. We don't have a global treaty on cyber crimes.
Yes, actually, I was going to ask that. What
we don't
do you
have,
think
but it's been initiated.
What do you think now is it's being initiated by the United Nations?
Well, I won't say it's being initiated and led by whom, but again, you should look at who's leading. So the NGOs are very mistrustful of the process of this move towards an international regulation of cyber crimes. But a preferred
yes,
model.
Actually, I was going to ask you your
preferred model. Yes, we have a preferred model. And the only international treaty is a regional treaty, but with international implications. It's known as the Budapest Convention on Cyber Crimes. And it was initiated in Europe, but it's open to any countries joining. So from Asia, you have Japan, Sri Lanka, and various other countries which have ratified. And it might be a good idea for some of these ASEAN countries to, if they really want to adopt balanced laws, to become parties to the Budapest Convention. What is the message of the Budapest Convention? Well, it's exactly what I've said. Budapest Convention provides examples of where you would need a national law against cybercrime. And it's not a general approach, it's specifics. For example, Budapest Convention talks about a law plus policy and practice against child pornography. And the child there is understood to be those under 18 years of age. Or the Budapest Convention talks about a cyber law against fraud or hacking and so on. So it's very, very specific rather than putting a lot of discretion in the hands of the authorities and letting them determine whatever they want, which seems to be the case among several ASEAN countries at the moment.
I see. That's a very good insight that you have shared with us, Professor Vitit, especially about the Budapest Convention and how laws should not be in a broad or general way. It has to cater specifically to to needs of certain people of certain states. Now, I want to ask you though, since we've talked about your first A, which is automation, the other two, we have algorithms and artificial intelligence. And you've mentioned in your article that algorithms are part of systematic data collection, often unbeknownst to the user, which may have a detrimental short and long-term impact on people's privacy, especially via digital profiling that leads to discrimination. Can you tell us more about that?
Algorithms is now becoming a familiar word. It's really about data, and it's about equations or formulae, how data are put together, and through that pattern, which is analyzed by machinery, you may have a certain conclusion or decision from that range of data, through that patterning, so to speak, of data. And of course, it's one that's very much part and parcel of cyber as a whole. I mean, you see it all the time. Even now, you are subjecting yourselves to algorithms. The fact that you've switched on to this program means that you're interested in certain something. So if I, for example, as the previous UN independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity, if I switch on to BL or Y series, particularly gay series and so on, I would be listed without my knowing through the algorithms for being someone interested in materials on sexual orientation, or particularly gays, or lesbians or bi or trans or whatever. You see, without my knowing. So a very important consideration of algorithms, or this patterning of data, which might lead to a conclusion or a judgment of someone, is to have a sense of balance in terms of people's privacy and the consent factor that we need to highlight when data are to be used. And this is a very leaky area in terms of seepage globally. Most countries of this region do not yet have personal data protection laws, although Thailand now has one, and one or two other countries have, but some other countries don't yet. And what these data protection laws impose, so to speak, is conditioning on release of data, personal data, which must be subject to the consent, free, prior, informed consent of the person covered by the data concern. In other words, you and me watching or listening to this pod, even at this point in time, if it's going to be released in terms of the patterning concerning how I would want to look at what's on the computer, for example. Now, this has given rise to very major issues, particularly in some regions. In Europe, one very famous case was the Costeja case in the European Union, where the Spanish national, who had problems with his property, he was put on the internet as one having problems with his property, and this data or URL related data was of course, suggesting that he might be on the verge of bankruptcy. But in fact, subsequently, he cleared all of this, and he cleared all his debts and so on, and he came out fine. But the data which suggested the potentiality of his becoming someone negative in terms of financial credibility was still there on the internet. So Costeja took action, which went up to the European Court of the Court of European Communities, not the European Court of Human Rights. Remember that this is the EU court, so it's an economic decision with a human rights implication. And the European Court upheld his claim that he had the right to be forgotten. So this is a very famous phrase that has arisen. So the right to be forgotten is basically to take down information from the internet that you do not want to be there because it's a breach of your privacy. So now the European Union is very fit on this. It has regulations on this, very strict on data protection. And Thailand is a very interesting country, you know. When the data protection law is implemented next year, it will be a crime, not just a civil wrong.
Really?
It's a crime, criminal, very high sanctions against those who reveal personal data, particularly companies, and even, of course, the public sector as well. So this is sort of seeped, interestingly, into ASEAN, but still many countries don't have personal data protection law yet. So, in fact, what you see in Europe in terms of the right to be forgotten is of relevance to us in ASEAN, but very often we don't know how to take down what's on the internet that we don't want there. Now, on this front, I think it's very important we look at it from various angles. Number one, the state in terms of the duty bearer. Number two, the industry, hard and soft. In other words, the business sector, but of course huge in terms of platforms, usually in the hands of private. And thirdly, the public at large. What is each stakeholder supposed to do? Well, you know, today we have this trinity of actions called for by the UN's guiding principles on business and human rights. So the state's supposed to have a certain framework to regulate. The private sector is supposed to have a certain response in terms of duty to respect the state's framework, which is based on the state's duty to protect human rights. And then together they're supposed to respond to a certain duty to remedy. But I want to look at it more from the angle of what's the state supposed to do, what's the private sector supposed to do, and what are we supposed to do, rather than just, you know, this triptych of the UN guiding principles. Number one, if the state is supposed to have a law, which is supposed to have a law, it should, of course, be grounded on international standards. So international standards, you have guidance in terms of privacy. Now, right to privacy is not an absolute right. It can be constrained by national security. It can be constrained by public order and so on.
Yes.
And if it's linked with expression, of course, it can be constrained in terms of impingement on people's reputation, particularly defamation. So the sort of law that comes into play should uphold data in terms of being part of the right to privacy. But it might have to also open the door to some exceptions. And those exceptions must be tested according to international standards. And the international standards are 3 or 4-fold. If you are to constrain certain rights, including the right to privacy, the state must prove that there is a reasonable law behind all this and not an arbitrary decision-making. In other words, the principle of legality. The state also has to prove that it's necessary to constrain the right. That is the principle of necessity. And thirdly, the state has to prove that the constraints are proportionate to the dangers and exigencies of the situation. In other words, the principle of proportionality. So those are very key linchpins if you're going to have a law for data protection and privacy protection. Having said that, what you see from particularly the European development of laws on data protection is that, of course, there can be some very concrete exemptions or exceptions based on the public interest. And what do they include? Well, for example, if the state needs to expose the data or collect the data for medical reasons or demographic reasons or very particular reasons. Then, if the state provides good reasoning for this, the constraints
So there
are,
must be a purpose. There must be a
must be
purpose,
a
a
proven purpose.
specific.
In international law, you test this according to legality, necessity, and proportionality. But in real terms now, you can see that in concrete substantive positioning of possible exemptions or exceptions, usually there's a possible exemption or exception in regard to demographic data or medical data. So very particular reasons which have a certain public interest, which is or are reasonable in the eyes of international standards. So that's one angle of the right to privacy as related to algorithms and privacy. Another angle, which is very interesting, is also that in Europe, apart from the right to be forgotten, which is now
Yes, in
become
the
part and parcel
Castejo
of the law,
case.
so to speak, there's also a right to portability. And some people
Mm.
ask, are these rights new or whatever? Well, actually, there's all part and parcel of your self-determination in a certain way in terms of control over data about yourself. But they are segmented a little bit in terms of entry points in the law. In Europe, the right to data portability is also covered by law, which means that if somebody or if the state holds data concerning you, if you wish to, with reasoning, shift that data to another whatever platform or another way of keeping the data, you are entitled to, and you can shift, you can make the data portable to your other end as your end users.
As the person who owns the data, as the one who owns the personal information.
That's correct. So you are, in a way, you are the end user, but you're also the owner. But it has to start from there. It has to start from there as you self-determining your data. Otherwise, you're going to possibly lose control of your, not only your privacy, but also self-protection in terms of how certain acts might impinge upon your data in terms of profiling, which could be negative and discriminatory or even violent against you.
Yes.
And all these things I don't think are being talked about enough in the ASEAN region yet, even though there is now a digital master plan of ASEAN 2025 projection. And this digital master plan of ASEAN is very much adopted in the throes of COVID. So a lot of it's about regeneration after COVID. It's about sharing, making broadband more accessible, allocating broadband more equitably. It does talk about inclusion, and that's okay in terms of enabling access, particularly to online. And we've just noted already the digital gap today. And it talks about rural connectivity. It does talk about hate speech and so on.
Countries.
But I'm not sure whether their appreciation of consumer harm, so to speak, to be protected from certain acts. I'm not sure whether they are aligned with international standards in this master plan. Why? Well, the simple fact that ASEAN countries, most of them are not democratic. So obviously the sort of messaging that they're going to come through an ASEAN plan of action is very much going to be along the line of a compromise between the political context of this region rather than abiding by the international standards, which we would prefer, of course.
I see. Well, wow, those are very insightful statements and reflections, Professor Vitit. Thank you very much for the things that you have mentioned, and I agree with you.
We have AI to talk about too.
Yes, actually, and thank you for that, because I was going to move on actually to the next A that you have mentioned. So we talked about automation, we talked about the algorithms, and now I would like to talk about now the next A, which is artificial intelligence. And the era of artificial intelligence and robots is actually already here. And on the one hand, robotization facilitates work and livelihoods by reducing human workloads and handling huge repetitive tasks without errors, definitely. It may also offer a helping hand in the era of our aging population, just like in Thailand. However, the negative side of it is already evident in the use of drones in warfare, and the ominous threats of killer robots as well. What are your thoughts about this, Professor?
Well, I think you've highlighted what I've also conveyed through various articles and so on, in terms of recognizing the positive input of robots, particularly medical robots that can help us in terms of sharing the chores in terms of looking after patients and so on. However, there are major concerns in terms of the artificial intelligence which is now with us. And there are 2 or 3 entry points that we have to be very careful and vigilant about. Number one is automated killing machines and the like. So it's not robots, but automated robots.
Automated
Meaning that the robot is it triggers itself rather than being triggered by a human. The capacity of technology is able to create these robots, and the UN very much has been very careful about this. The messaging is that we're not in favor of, we are against killer robots. We are against automated killing machines. Now, that might be a messaging in terms of a political messaging, but how do you do it in terms of legislative or international legal control or regulation on this? The entry point on this front is one that has to be developed from existing international instruments. And the main international instruments on weapons, as killer robots would be aligned with these weapons, is the Convention on Conventional Weapons. In other words, CCW. This is an old treaty which has various protocols, and the protocols include prohibition of laser weapons, for example.
Laser weapons.
Okay. Blinding laser weapons are prohibited as one of the protocols to this convention. And they are now developing an additional protocol which could cover automated weapons. And if that comes into practice or into being, then there will be a certain regulation, a certain definition of automated killing weapons, and a certain control process, prohibition, as well as supervision and accountability. So we're waiting for this. But also interesting is the fact that most ASEAN countries are not parties to the Convention on Conventional Weapons. So the first thing you have to do is to encourage them to become parties to this international treaty. And then the second thing is, of course, to wait and maybe to be involved in the evolution of a new protocol, which is an additional treaty on the issue of automated killing weapons. The second entry point, yes.
Okay, yes, sorry, go ahead. The second entry point.
The second entry point is one that's very much in the concern or purview of the UN at the moment. The most recent reports of the OHCHR, particularly from the High Commission of Human Rights, have called for a moratorium, a suspension of the use of facial recognition technology, which is very much linked with robotized analysis of data, particularly remote data, and remote data which are sort of based on surveillance, lifelong surveillance, which is already being used in certain areas of Asia. I don't need to name a certain country particularly that has very extensive surveillance of its minority, for example. So it's there, and the message from the OHCHR is to have a moratorium on facial recognition technology, particularly in high-risk situations. Now, there's no treaty on this yet, but the messaging at interim is very much to have a suspension. And the most concrete example of how facial recognition technology may, as a biometric entry point, impinge on people's rights is in regard to street demonstrations. Because street demonstrations.
Okay.
Because if you use facial recognition technology in regard to protesters, collected data already matching with the faces of protesters, those who are demonstrators, you'll be sort of matching the data in terms of profiling, not just social profiling, but criminal profiling of the person under a very extensive, lifelong, actually, surveillance system, which is both remote and very present in terms of the actuality of what's being measured. And then with of course, all the consequences in terms of a very repressive measures coming into play through this surveillance based on a robotized system of facial recognition. Even though some aspects of recognition are already permissible, your biometric passport, for example. The fact that you have fingerprint or your slight sort of retina imaging, etc. But what we're very much concerned with is when robots, particularly through facial recognition or other forms of recognition, stigmatize and socially profile people for surveillance and national security purposes. And of course, if you look at that in the perspective of the totality of the Asian region, you have so many non-democracies in this region that it's very dangerous when there's a move towards this profiling of people. And it's a very dangerous affair. And it's already happening. So we have to be very vocal about this and enable people to understand that all the CCTVs, around here, just go out on the street. Outside my door, you go out and you have 3 cameras
right away.
already.
Yes.
Already. Yeah. But Thailand is not known for too much profiling in Bangkok. But we have DNA profiling and so on, sadly, in terms of issues being raised, particularly in southern Thailand. But it will be connected ultimately, because DNA ultimately will be data.
Yes.
And it will also be part of the profiling, and then it'll be part of the policing policy ultimately, or militarization policy of security using various forms of biometric recognition. So these are dangers which are very much with us, and we should be very careful. Even though we've already recognized that AI can help a lot in the medical field, in doing some of the very meticulous work that humans aren't too good at doing and so on. We don't deny all that, but we do have to be very vigilant about technology that is used for national security purposes and surveillance purposes, particularly by undemocratic regimes.
I agree with that, Professor Vitit. I mean, it's true that we are now living in a very it's a very scary reality that, we could just be profiled anytime and data could just be collected. I mean, data about us could just be collected right away. And before we know it, we are already being profiled, or the things that we do or what
already.
Yes. And I like that you mentioned a while ago that we have to be vigilant about these things, because if we don't do anything about it, if we're not vocal about these things, then everything will just have to be in the context of national security and in the government or certain states having to justify it through those means. But the privacy, the right to privacy of every person is already compromised. So thank you very much for that very good insight, Professor Vitit. Thank you. And since we've already covered your 3 A's, which is artificial intelligence, automation, and algorithms, I guess now I would like to ask you, although you've already mentioned a while ago that the ASEAN should have a framework or a better model when it comes to shaping its laws to regulate the internet or cyberspace or artificial intelligence and all those other things. Aside from that, though, is there anything that the ASEAN could look up to, or I mean, you mentioned a while ago about the Budapest Convention, correct? And the Robot Convention. Other than that, though, aside from joining or signing into treaties, how about the ASEAN people? Are they also, or what do you think can they do aside from maybe urge their governments to do something about it? I mean, what are your thoughts about it?
Well, the easy entry point is this. ASEAN already has a digital master plan until the year 2025. Mm-hmm. So what we should call for is a human rights centered digital master plan. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's the easiest.
So geared towards human rights.
Yes, all the things we're talking about. And in fact, apart from 3As, I had 3 stakeholders that I would expand a bit. Number 1 is what the state's supposed to do. Number 2 is what the private sector is supposed to do. And number 3 is the consumer and the user, as well as whoever's putting information on the internet. Now, the first one we responded to already in terms of we need human rights sensitive laws, policies, and practice from the state on these issues. And the evidence would suggest that we don't have them very much in this region, and certainly nothing akin to the Budapest Convention. In fact, the tendency at the moment is to have very general laws in these countries which put too much discretion in the hands of not very democratic entities, sadly, in ASEAN at this point in time. So let's be careful there, and then let's say, well, if you want to look to a preferred approach, then there's a Budapest Convention. And if we're going to have an international treaty, we also have to be careful, because you have to look at who's propelling it this moment. Because why? If international treaty on cybercrimes is too expansive, it will impede freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly. Because that's the way cybercrimes operate ultimately, in terms of some limitations on how we express ourselves or team up, including this assembly on the internet. Number 2 is the private sector, particularly the platform, the biggies, as well as the softies. It's very interesting that here you have 2 or 3 entry points for their operations. And this is very much also in relation to hate speech. They can have, number 1, the platforms, the private sector can adopt a code of conduct, which might set even higher standards than what the state would adopt in terms of perhaps hate speech, which appears on the internet. Number 2, it can have a sort of self-regulation with certain monitoring of self-regulation, and that is linked with the first issue that I just raised, self-regulation, but monitoring under that. Thirdly, it can explore and put conditions in the contract that it has with the user. Now, most of us have to click, don't we, and agree. That's already a contract. And when
our consent, our consent.
Yeah, yes. When you click, you haven't read all the 100 pages. These are standard form contracts. You haven't read. But what's interesting also is that the good part of some of these contracts is that they go further than international standards. For example, they prohibit homophobia. So if you put homophobic information on the internet, it can be taken down by the platform or by the internet service provider, even though the state law might not prohibit homophobia as such. So these are private sector self-regulation modalities, so to speak, and there's a contractual element there. And in fact, the contractual element, according to us, also means that if we see certain information about ourselves on the internet, by contract and the consent factor, we could also ask for the information to be taken down as part of a sort of private sector responsibility under the right to be forgotten. And the big ones agree to this already. And in Europe, of course, they are compelled to, in terms of respecting the right of the consumer to, or the user to take the information down. So that's an entry point. And the other one is to help filter and blockage, a technological block. But technical block is at times dangerous because it's too automatic and it doesn't provide enough flexibility in terms of deciding whether it's reasonable or not according to the standards at stake, and ultimately will affect freedom of expression and freedom of assembly again. And then you have other actors coming into play in terms of course, artificial intelligence as well. So screening and then blocking and taking things down. And from a human element, you have new professions arising. You have moderators, content moderators, which might be human or artificial intelligence. You have content feeders, those who complain, they're the whistleblowers, feeding in that content should be taken down. And then you have the checkers, those who check before taking the information down. And we know that one of the big platforms has an oversight committee whereby if your information is taken down, your data is taken down, you can also complain to put back your information. So this is a converse situation, not the right to be forgotten now, but the right to be remembered.
Remembered, yes, exactly.
To be remembered also. And I was talking with a member of this oversight committee of one very big platform that shall remain nameless, that is also possibly linked with metaverse, and he said that the oversight committee receives hundreds of thousands of communications a year. I didn't know. I was just, so confounded by this statistic. And I had assumed, firstly, that when they take this down, it's the complaints are that they don't take down enough information, such as homophobia. But it's the reverse. It's those who've been taken down who complain to be put back to be remembered.
Yeah, rather than it's the opposite.
And you have to be slightly liberal in terms of enabling freedom of expression to take place also. I mean, some hate speech should be tolerated. But if it's hate speech that is discriminatory and that can lead to violence, then it's the sort of hate speech that should be taken down as well as prohibited by the state. But, just to say, I hate A, I mean, you have other ways of dealing with this, and we'll get to the consumer in a moment. It's not just self-regulation or state regulation that does the trick at all, because you're going to impede one's sentiments about expression and whatever that would be externalized. Now, having said that, that's the second part. And so your checkers, your feeders, your moderators have to be in the loop, so to speak. And if they are AI, it's very important that you must have humans somewhere behind. So today we advocate very much the humans in command approach. Humans in command approach. As regards internet, human in the loop approach. And Europe is now working on a protocol on this, particularly on the hate speech phenomenon and the interlink with these issues of automation, algorithm, and AI. Now, lastly, I come to the consumer or the user or whoever's sort of putting the data. I mean, all of you, all of us, particularly those sharing all the time, Instagram, et cetera, et cetera. So what are we supposed to do? I mean, there is a certain self-responsibility that we have to bear in mind. I would say this. First of all, there's no alternative to an educated public. Why? Because if the public is intelligent enough and critically analytical enough, you don't have to believe so much of what's on the internet, including the so-called fake news and so on.
Yes, actually,
I was going to leave it to the state to have a law or the internet to have self-regulation on this. And the very famous phrase from some of the documents is, the state should not be an arbiter of the truth. So you must tolerate fake news, information, misinformation, disinformation to some extent. Especially if the public is intelligent enough to differentiate between this and that and not to believe. So intelligent public should be careful enough not to believe.
Yes.
And that will need plural information, very diverse information, which needs democracy.
Yes.
So autocracy will not enable you to share information. On the contrary, it's propaganda or misinformation, disinformation. So autocracy, authoritarianism breeds misinformation, disinformation. And that is the, I would say, the UN premise as well. So think about it in terms of power relations, not only through data, but also who holds the reins of power. So from the user perspective, or the enabler in terms of putting information on the internet, there's no alternative to an educated public. And if you have an educated public, which is also empathetic, not apathetic, but empathetic, understanding, kind, compassionate, plural in terms of understanding sensibilities, all these help a lot in terms of self-determination, in terms of what we want to put on the net, as well as what we want to believe from the internet.
Yes.
And that is back to very liberal education, which needs democratic classrooms again.
Yes.
So, you're
Wow.
back to square one. I mean, it's a very close link between human rights and democracy from the smallest level to the bigger level. And
Yeah.
so the ultimate, if it's a solution or palliative, is that, of course, we need very liberal, empathetic education, which
Mhm.
enables people to be kind to others, to be understanding, to be tolerant, mutually respectful, and so on. And this is another way of dealing with hate crimes, rather than just having the stamp of regulation, prohibition, which ultimately might impede information flow as well as freedom of expression. And lastly, I think from the user perspective, what we'd like also is for users to group up, to advocate against bad things. So this is called counter speech or alternative speech. So if you have hate
Okay.
speech on, sort of sign of hatred on the internet, you as a group can also say, you don't agree with this. It's not nice. It shouldn't be there, and you express yourselves as a group to counter what is not good on the internet. That's another way of socializing and pressurizing. So through social interaction, connectivity, to
Mhm.
ensure that there's a preferred way of dealing with whatever is on the internet in terms of data. So, in fact, what you see in terms of these three stakeholders is that there are different elements that each can take up and empower and
Empower. Yes, yes,
maximize
empower.
in
I
terms of
agree.
itself, in terms of its own prevention strategy, as well as protection, as well as curative strategy in terms of respect for human rights.
Wow. Thank you very much, Professor Vitit. I mean, that is, I like the fact that you were able to put it all in like a full circle. I mean, the way that you were able to
That's very
connect
nice.
one,
Thank you.
yes, one sector to another, and how each sector is actually very important and should be empowered
Yeah,
because
thanks.
each has an important role in this whole thing. It shouldn't just be about the state or the consumer or the private sector. It has, I mean, each sector has to have his, I mean, its role, sorry, his her its role in this whole guarding human rights in the age of cyberspace, of artificial intelligence, of automation and algorithms.
One final message.
Yes, sure. Go ahead, Professor.
Don't forget the word spirit.
Ah,
Spirit.
yes, spirit,
You cannot
definitely.
have technology
Mhm.
alone by itself without a
Yeah.
certain human spirit to shape it. In fact, if we look at technology, including digitalization, it's sort of value neutral in a way until humans use it and abuse it or abuse others through it. So the spirit of kindness, care,
Yes. Mm.
consideration, understanding, all these are very important elements of a certain human empathy that I
Mhm.
advocate. And you're not just going to have it by interacting with the machine in front of you. I have come across ASEAN youth, and I asked them what sort of community-related activity you want to do to help others, and so
Mhm.
I made them compete. Um, one or two groups just wanted to type on the internet on their machine to have programming, but in fact, while that is okay at one level, perhaps to raise some funds, how are you going to learn a sense of humanity from this screen, which is metallic, and the
Mhm.
data and the algorithm that's working on my privacy as well, without my knowing? What you need ultimately is human to human with human interaction. So
Interaction. Yes.
I
Yes.
value and advocate very much voluntary work, helping other people. I do voluntary work almost every day, every week. I mean, yesterday,
Yes.
for example, I went to an Amnesty International session, and I had to wrap up the whole thing as a sort of educational process, and it was totally pro bono free. And
Mm.
my work for the UN as UN Special Rapporteur now, independent expert, etc. All those little chores, so to speak, if they are chores, but the tasks they are pro bono. I'm not a UN official who's paid, and I'm proud of the fact that I can help the UN as a volunteer. I get a bit of per diem when I travel, etc. But the rest is all free. I write for free. So I think it's a very important element to sustain your spirit. And it is that spirit that will give you hope.
Yes, I was going to say.
Enable you to overcome the sense of frustration when you say, oh, these bad human rights issues. The machinery in front of you is not going to give you that much hope, especially if you're pouring on this. And the nephew of someone that I was talking about the other day, he pours over the machinery playing games till 4 a.m. It's a drug. Not very good for him. So just vary your activity a bit. Sustain your programming with humans. Work with vulnerable groups. Be a carer in a way, a technological carer too, in terms of pushing technology to people who don't have access, and then make sure that you have a sense of humanity in what you do. And with that, I think we will be able to sustain a spirit of constructive development, which is a mutually developmental exercise that I learned from the villagers that I worked with 40, 50 years ago, or the seniors I worked with almost 60 years ago maybe, pruning trees and watering plants and washing windows, all for free. I like that. Still with me. Yeah. So don't forget, you nurture a sense of humanity by undertaking humane actions.
Yes. Wow. Thank you for that, Professor Vitit. And I guess it's a very nice way to cap off our podcast episode for the night, for today, because you actually gave us some sense of not just spirit, but hope as well. So we are very much privileged and honored to have you in our show tonight. And I personally would like to thank you, because after this episode, I have a lot of insights. And with I guess your last message as well, it resonated on me. And it all just has to go back to the spirit. And that spirit gives us that hope. I mean, robots or artificial intelligence cannot give us that hope. It's human interaction. It's having that spirit in us. And on that note, Professor, I'd like to thank you so much for this very timely and relevant food for thought at a time when technology, artificial intelligence, automation is evolving the way we work and live. So thank you very much, Professor. And
thank you very much. Look after yourselves. Enjoy the rhythm of your life.
Yes, thank you.
The spirit truly rhythmic and reverberate. Yes. Reverberate. Wow. Well done.
I like that word, reverberate. Yes, indeed. So that's all for today's episode, guys. I wish I could have more time with Professor Vitit, but we've learned so many things from him for this ASEAN Peoples Speak. Thank you all for listening, and thank you, Professor Vitit, for joining me today. I guess, would you like to promote anything? Any website or organization? But I guess you've already promoted enough by saying that we just keep that spirit in us and that hope as well, which is very much important and very relevant, especially in our times. So join us again, guys, next week, and make sure that you subscribe to the podcast on Spotify so that you never miss an episode. We encourage you to subscribe to our Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube channel at ASEAN HRMech, and to visit our website, ASEANHRMech.org. This has been your host for tonight, Regine Jessica Abuel. And thank you again, Professor Vitit. Have a wonderful night, guys. Good night. Goodbye. Good night.